In 1918, the world was impacted by a great influenza virus. In the United States alone, over 650,000 people died from this influenza virus. Worldwide, the number was well over 1 million. Over this next 30 to 45 minutes, I will discuss that pandemic, that influenza virus, but I'll also talk about what's feared to be the next pandemic, which would be the avian influenza virus. In 1918, as the story is told, a year of momentous extermination of most cruel war in the annals of the human race, a year which marked the end, at least for a time, of man's destruction of man. Unfortunately, a year in which developed the most fatal infectious disease, causing death of hundreds of thousands of human beings. Medical science, for 4.5 years, devoted itself to putting men on firing lines and keeping them there. Now it must turn with its whole might to combating the greatest enemy of all, infectious disease. This was written December 28, 1918. The influenza pandemic at that time was a large-scale epidemic. It was the influenza virus. This is referred to as the 1918 Spanish flu. The World Health Organization warns that there is a substantial risk of influenza pandemic in the next few years. One of the strongest candidates for this is a highly pathogenic variation referred to as the H5N1 subtype of avian influenza, which is rapidly mutating and could mutate into a variation that transmits easily human to human, causing a pandemic. Of the three types of the influenza virus, there's type A, type B, type C. Only type A exhibits the subtype variation defined by a particular combination of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase surface proteins. Now, these surface proteins are abbreviated by H and by N, respectively, in the virus subtype designation. Now, those of you who are taking microbiology, these terms, hemagglutinin and neuramidases, as surface proteins, make a lot more sense, especially when we talk about using these as the virus subtype designation. But this is where the name avian flu, or H5N1, is derived from. Because of its presence, because of the presence of specific receptors in the human respiratory tract, on the surface of the protein of hemagglutinin and neuramidases typically will infect humans. So only specific types of receptors in these specific type of proteins can infect humans. There are about 15 distinct types of hemagglutinin surface proteins, but only 3 hemagglutinins, hemagglutinin 1 through 3 or H1 through 3, are subtypes that typically infect humans. There are 9 distinct neuraminidase surface proteins, but only 2 neuramidases 1 through 2 or N1 through 2. These are the antigenic subtypes that typically will infect humans. Domestic fowl, mostly chickens, are usually infected by H5 or H7 subtypes, which are associated with a preferred binding of an avian-specific respiratory tract receptor. All antigenic subtypes may occur in any combination of waterfowl or migratory birds such as wild ducks, which are the primary reservoir for the influenza A virus. Domestic fowl, most notably chickens, are usually infected with H5 or H7 subtypes, which are associated with preferred binding to avian-specific respiratory tract receptors. Some pandemics are relatively minor. They can be contained quickly, as the one in 1957 that only killed around 1 million people throughout the world. Mutations in viruses that cause high infectious rates may also cause the virus to be more or less deadly, as it needs to pass between a host to host to replicate itself. Now, in a bad pandemic, some communities attempt to cut themselves off totally, while others, or more, will try to cut their population in half. Others may not feel as many are the effect, but they may still be affected due to the high degree of illness and bereavement felt by members of the community. So the larger the number of people that die from these types of pandemics, it will affect entire communities or entire regions, because typically loved ones, relatives will be impacted by the effect of the disease. In 1918, the pandemic killed around 150,000 people in the United Kingdom. But even the loss of this relatively small number of people in the population caused an upheaval and psychological damage to many people. This is a letter that was written by a physician in one of the U.S. Army camps in 1918 pandemic. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. It's horrible. One can stand it to see 1, 2, 20 men die. But to see these poor devils dropping like flies. We've been averaging about 100 deaths per day. Pneumonia means in about all cases of death. We have lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. It takes special trains to carry away the dead. For several days there were no coffins, and the bodies piled up something fierce. There are not enough doctors, hospital rooms, medical supplies for the living due to the contracting of the disease, and the dead bodies often lie unburied, for few people are available to deal with them. There is a great social disruption and a sense of fear in efforts to deal with the pandemic always leaves a great deal of desire due to selfishness, lack of trust, illegible behavior or illegal behavior, and ignorance. For example, in 1918, the horrific disconnect between the reassurances and realities destroyed the credibility of the authorities. People felt that they had no one to turn to, no one to rely on, and no one to trust. There is a significant problem with governmental agencies and those who are placed in positions to provide knowledge and information. There's this constant behavior of trying to reassure and to protect the general public. But once the general public finds out that those officials are not credible and that the events are a lot worse than they were initially led on to believe, then the people feel like that they no longer can trust those in charge. This leads to social chaos. Pandemics come in waves. Flu pandemics typically come in waves. In 1889 and 1890, and in the 1918 and 1919 flu pandemics, each came in 3 or 4 waves of increasing lethality. But within a wave, mortality was greater at the beginning of the wave. The influenza pandemic of 1918 through 1919 killed more people than the Great War, also known today as World War I, at somewhere between 20 and 40 million people. It has been cited as the most devastating epidemic in recorded history. More people died of influenza in a single year than in 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague of 1347 to 1351. The Spanish influenza of 1918 through 1919, known as the Spanish flu, or in French, la grippe, was a global disaster. In pockets across the globe, something erupted seemed to be as benign as a common cold. The influenza that season, however, was far more than a cold. In 2 years that this scourge ravaged the earth, 1/5 of the world's population was infected. The flu was the most deadly for people of ages between 20 and 40. Now note, this pattern of morbidity was unusual for influenza, which usually is a killer of the elderly population and young children. But this infection infected 28% of all Americans. An estimated 675,000 Americans died of influenza during the pandemic, 10 times as many as in the World War. Of the U.S. soldiers who died in Europe, half of them fell to influenza virus and not to the enemy. An estimated 43,000 servicemen mobilized for World War I died of influenza. 1918 would go down as an unforgettable year of suffering, death, and yet of peace. The effect of the influenza epidemic was so severe that the average lifespan in the U.S. was depressed by 10 years. The influenza virus had a profound virulence with a mortality rate of 2.5% compared to that of previous influenza epidemics, which were less than 0.1%. The death rate for the 15 to 34-year-olds of influenza and pneumonia were 20 times higher in 1918 than any previous years. Very important to note this significant pattern, the age group that was impacted here. Again, on the previous slide, it reported the age between 20 and 30. Here, relatively the same, between 15 and 34, 20 times higher than what we see in a typical morbidity rate. Also, I'd like to pay note to the mortality rate of this particular virus. Mortality rate here is 2.5%. This is the worst pandemic that we've known in U.S. history. It's estimated that the smallpox virus, if that would become activated and lead into a pandemic, has a 30% mortality rate. Remember, millions of people died from this influenza virus. You could only imagine the effect of a smallpox virus. The effects of the influenza pandemic: people were struck with illness on the street and died rapid deaths. One anecdotal note shared in 1918 was that of 4 women who were playing bridge together late into the night. Overnight, 3 of the 4 women died from influenza. Others told stories of people who were on their way to work suddenly developing the flu and dying within hours. The origins of the deadly flu disease were unknown but widely speculated upon. Some of the Allies thought that it was the epidemic related to a biological warfare tool invented by the Germans. Many thought it was a result of trench warfare, the use of mustard gas, which generated smoke and fumes of the war. A national campaign began using ready rhetoric of war to fight the new enemy of microscopic proportions. The origin of this influenza variant is not precisely known. It is thought to have originated in China in a rare genetic shift of the influenza virus. The recombination of its surface proteins created a virus novel to almost everyone and a loss of herd immunity. If you recall from microbiology, herd immunity refers to when a general population has an immunity to particular types of viruses or infectious diseases. Here, herd immunity was lost. Recently, the virus has been reconstructed from the tissue of dead soldiers and now is genetically being characterized. The name Spanish flu came from an early affliction and a large mortality in Spain, where allegedly it killed 8 million people in May 1918. The first wave of influenza appeared early in the spring of 1918 in Kansas and on military camps throughout the United States. Few noticed the epidemic in the midst of the war. There was virtually no response or acknowledgement to the epidemics until March, April in the military camps. It was unfortunate that no steps were taken to prepare the usual recurrence of virulent influenza strains in the winter. The lack of action was later criticized when epidemic could not be ignored in the winter of 1918. The first epidemic at training camps were a sign of what was coming to be of a greater magnitude in the fall and the winter of 1918 and to the entire world. The war brought the virus back into the United States for a second wave of epidemic. The first arrived in Boston in September 1918 through a port, or a very, very busy port, where warships and machinery and supplies were coming in and going out. The war also enabled the virus to spread rapidly in a diffuse manner. Men across nations were mobilizing to join the military and to join the cause. As they came together, they brought a virus with them into those who contacted them. The virus killed 200,000 people in October of 1918 alone. On November 11th of 1918, the end of the war enabled a resurgence of the virus, as people celebrated Armistice Day and parades and large parties commenced. A complete disaster from a public health standpoint, a rebirth of the epidemic occurred in some cities. The flu that winter was beyond imagination, as millions were infected and thousands died. Just as the war had affected the course of influenza, influenza affected the war. Entire fleets were ill with disease, and men on the front lines were too sick to fight. The flu was devastating to both sides, killing more men than their own weapons could. With the military patients coming home from the war with battle wounds and mustard gas burns, hospital facilities and staffs were taxed to the limit. This created a shortage of physicians, especially in the civilian sector, as many had been lost to the service with the military. Since medical practitioners were away with troops, only medical students were left to care for the sick. In some areas of the United States, the nursing shortage was so acute that the Red Cross had to ask local businesses to allow workers to have a day off if they could volunteer at the hospitals at night. The shortage was further confounded by the added loss of physicians and nurses to the epidemic. In the United States, the Red Cross had to recruit more volunteers and to contribute to the new cause at home of fighting the influenza epidemic. The pandemic affected 1/4 of the United States and 1/5 of the world infected with the influenza. It was impossible to escape from the illness. President Woodrow Wilson suffered from the flu in early 1919 while negotiating a crucial Treaty of Versailles to end the World War. Those who were lucky enough to avoid infection had to deal with the public health ordinances to restrain the spread of disease. The public health departments distributed gauze masks, which were worn in public. Stores could not hold sales. Funerals were limited to 15 minutes. Some towns required a signed certificate to enter, and railroads would not accept passengers without them. Those who ignored the flu ordinances had to pay steep fines and were enforced by extra officers. Bodies piled up as massive deaths of the epidemic ensued. Besides the lack of healthcare workers and the medical supplies, there was a shortage of coffins, morticians, and grave diggers. The conditions in 1918 were not so far removed from the Black Death in the era of the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. In 1918 through 1919, the deadly influenza pandemic erupted in the final stages of World War I. The nations were already attempting to deal with the effects and the cost of the war. Propaganda campaigns of the war, restriction, rations, and implementation were implemented by governments. Nationalism pervaded as people accepted the government authority. This allowed the public health departments to easily step in and implement restrictive measures. Sorry. Now, let's compare that and talk a little bit about the avian influenza, the H5N1 infection in humans, generally caused by birds to human transmission of the virus. There are a few isolated cases of suspected human-to-human transmission that exist, but there's no real proof that this has indeed happened at this point. The H5N1 flu refers to a transmission and infection of the H5N1 virus. H5N1 influenza is a concern due to the global spread of H5N1 that constitutes a pandemic threat. The presentation will discuss the transmission of the H5N1 virus, infection by the virus, the resulting symptoms of that infection, of those who come down with it. Specifically the avian flu, even more specifically H5N1 flu, which can include pneumonia, and the medical response that is included in this treatment. Infected birds pass on H5N1 through their saliva, nasal secretions, and feces. Other birds may pick up the virus throughout direct contact with these excretions or when they have contact with surfaces contaminated with material. Because of the migratory pattern of birds, they are among carriers of the H5N1 virus. It may spread to all parts of the world. Past outbreaks of avian flu have often originated in crowded conditions in Southeast or East Asia, where humans, pigs, and poultry live in close quarters. In these conditions, the virus can mutate into one form or another and easily infect humans. The majority of H5N1 flu the majority of the H5N1 flu cases have been reported in Southeast and East Asia. Once an outbreak is detected, local authorities often order a mass slaughter of birds or animals affected. If this is done properly, the outbreak of avian flu may be prevented. However, the United Nations and the World Health Organization has expressed concern that not all countries are responding to outbreaks as completely as they should. China, for example, is known to have officially denied past outbreaks of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, and HIV. The H5N1 infections in humans are generally caused by bird-to-human transmission of the virus. A few isolated cases of suspected human-to-human transmission exist, but there is no proof at this point that either way those cases. A wild waterfowl most likely plays a role in the avian influenza cycle and could be the initial source of avian influenza viruses, which may be passed through contact with resident waterfowl or domestic poultry, particularly domestic ducks. The virus undergoing mutation could circulate within the domestic bird and possibly the resident bird population. This new virus is pathogenic to poultry and possibly to wild birds that it arose from. Wild birds found to have been infected with this mutation were either sick or dead. The findings in China, Quanhain Lake, China, suggest that H5N1 virus could possibly be transmitted between migratory birds. Additionally, the new outbreaks of the virus, poultry, wild birds in Russia, Afghanistan, Western China, and Mongolia, may indicate that migratory birds probably act as carriers for transport of viruses over longer distances. Short distances between farms, villages, and contaminated water or local water bodies is likewise a distinct possibility. The current method of prevention in animal populations is to destroy infected animals as well as animals suspected of being infected. In Southeast Asia, millions of domestic birds have been slaughtered to prevent the spread of the virus. The probability of a humanized form of H5N1 emerging through genetic recombination in the body of a human co-infected with H5N1 and another influenza virus type, a process called reassortment, could be reduced in influenza vaccine or vaccination of those at risk by H5N1. The point in this is to point out even those of us in the United States should receive our routine influenza vaccination. Now, the routine influenza vaccination will not protect you against H5N1. However, it would prevent the H5N1 virus or its counterpart from mutating, from binding with another influenza type to form a more resistant strain. As discussed earlier, it's not clear at this point whether the vaccine production and immunization could be stepped up sufficiently enough to meet the demands that would be required in the event of a pandemic. If outbreaks of pandemic flu does occur, its spread might be slowed down by increasing the hygiene of aircrafts, especially when we look at international travel and domestic travel, and by examining airline cabins of air filters and the presence of the H5N1 virus. The American Centers of Disease Control and Prevention advises travelers to in areas of Asia where outbreaks of H5N1 have occurred to avoid poultry farms and animals in live food markets. Travelers should also avoid surfaces that appear to be contaminated by feces and from any other kind of animal, but especially poultry. Avian flu viruses can last forever. At a temperature of dozens of degrees below freezing, as is found in most of the areas where the migratory birds will frequent. Heat will kill this virus, so heat kills the H5N1 virus. Over 30 days at 0 degrees or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, over 1 month at freezing temperatures, 6 days at 37 degrees or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 week at human body temperature, 30 minutes at 60 degrees or 140 degrees Fahrenheit, half an hour at temperatures that cause second and or third degree burns in humans in less than 5 seconds. So obviously these extreme temperatures of 140 degrees Fahrenheit is the reason why most of the destroyed poultry livestock has been burned. The incubation period. The human incubation period for avian influenza A virus, or H5N1, is said to be anywhere between 2 to 17 days. Once infected, the virus spreads by cell-to-cell contact, bypassing receptors. So even if a strain is very hard to initially catch, once infected, it spreads rapidly within the body. H5N1 is an influenza virus. Symptoms similar to those of the common flu, such as fever, cough, sore throat, sore muscles, can develop in infected humans. In more severe cases, pneumonia and respiratory failure can develop and eventually cause death. Severe infections from H5N1 cause multiple lung infections, including pus, fever and cough, lung scarring, fluid in spaces surrounding the lungs, and large lymph nodes and cavities forming lung tissue. Flu virus-induced increases in the level of cytokines is also associated with flu symptoms, including fever, chills, vomiting, and headaches. Tissue damage associated with the pathogenic flu virus infected can ultimately result in death. If avian influenza remains an animal problem with limited human-to-human transmission, it is not a pandemic, though it continues to pose a risk. To prevent the situation from progressing to a pandemic, following short-term strategies have been put forward. Number one, culling and vaccinating livestock. Number two would be vaccinating poultry workers against the common flu. Again, in vaccinating the workers against the common flu, it would decrease the chance of a mutation occurring between the avian flu virus and the routine flu viruses that we experience on a yearly basis. Also, limiting travel in areas where viruses are found. Again, as a review, the rationale for vaccinating poultry workers against the common flu is that it reduces the probability of the common influenza virus that we typically are exposed to from recombining with an avian H5N1 virus in the bloodstream of poultry workers to form a pandemic strain. Longer-term strategies proposed for regions where high pathogenic H5N1 is endemic in wild birds. This would be changing local farming practices to increase farm hygiene and to reduce contact between livestock and wild birds. Altering farming practices in regions where animals live in close, often unsanitary quarters with people, and changing practices of open-air wet markets where birds are slaughtered in unsanitary conditions near fruits and vegetables. As far as vaccines go, a vaccine probably would not be available in the initial stages of the population infection. Once a potential virus has been identified, it normally takes at least several months before a vaccine becomes widely available, as it must be developed and tested and authorized. The capability to produce vaccine varies widely from country to country. In fact, only 15 countries are listed as influenza vaccine manufacturers, according to the World Health Organization. It's estimated that the best scenario would be 750 million doses would be produced each year, whereas it is likely that each individual would need 2 doses of the vaccine in order to become immunocompetent. Now that's a key point. Distribution to and inside countries would probably be problematic. Several countries, however, have well-developed plans of producing large quantity of vaccine. For example, Canada's health authorities say that they are developing the capacity to produce 32 million dosages within 4 months, enough vaccine to inoculate every person in the country. There are several H5N1 vaccines for several of the avian H5N1 varieties. H5N1 continually mutates, rendering them, so far for humans, of little use. While there can be some cross-protection against related flu strains, the best protection would be from a vaccine specifically produced for any future pandemic flu virus strain. There are 2 serious technical problems associated with the development of vaccines against H5N1. The first problem, seasonal influenza vaccines require a single injection of about 15 micrograms hemagglutinin in order to give protection. H5 seems to evoke only a weak immune response, and so a large multicentric trial found that 2 injections of 90 micrograms of H5 given 28 days apart provided protection only in about 54% of the people. Now recognize what we're saying here. It takes 2 separate injections which need to be given at least 28 days apart. So even if it's considered to be 54% acceptable level of protection, which we know is a very poor number, the world is currently capable of producing only 900 million dosages of a strength of 15 micrograms. Assuming that all productions were immediately converted into manufacturing the H5 vaccine, if only 2 injections of 90 micrograms are needed, then the capacity drops to only 70 million. That's significant, and we're still not sure how effective these vaccines will be. Sorry as my dog barks. Problems with the vaccine. Additionally, trials using adjuvant lower the dose of the vaccine are urgently needed. A second problem is that there are 2 circulating clades of viruses. Clade 1 is a virus originally located in Vietnam, and Clade 2 is a virus isolated in Indonesia. Current vaccine research is focused on Clade 1 virus, but the Clade 2 virus is antigenically distinct, and a Clade 1 vaccine will probably not protect against a pandemic caused by Clade 2 virus. Currently, influenza vaccines for an annual seasonal influenza program comes from 4 manufacturers. However, only a single manufacturer produces the annual vaccine entirely within the United States. Thus, when a pandemic occurred, existing U.S.-based influenza manufacturing capacity was completely diverted, or would be completely diverted, to producing pandemic vaccine. The supply would be severely limited. Moreover, because the annual influenza manufacturing process takes place during most of the year, the time capacity to produce a vaccine against a potential pandemic virus for a stockpile while continuing annual influenza vaccine production is limited. Since supply will be limited, it is critical for human health services to be able to direct vaccine distribution according to predefined groups. Human health services will ensure that building capacity and will engage states in a discussion about the purchase and distribution of pandemic influenza vaccine. The protective immune response generated by the current influenza vaccine is largely based on viral hemagglutinin and neuramidases antigens in the vaccine. We discussed the receptors specifically in the human epithelial tissue to hemagglutinin and neuramidases in particular strains of the avian flu virus. As a consequence, the basis of the influenza vaccine manufacturing is growing massive quantities of virus in order to have sufficient amount to have protein antigens to stimulate the immune response. The influenza vaccine used in the United States and around the world are manufactured by growing viruses in fertilized hen eggs, a commercial process that has been in place for decades. To achieve current vaccine production, which targets millions in 11-day-old fertilized eggs, must be available every day for production. In the near term, future expansion of these systems will provide additional capacity in the U.S.-based production of both seasonal and pandemic vaccines. However, the surge capacity that will be needed for a pandemic response cannot be met by an egg-based vaccine production alone, as it is impractical to develop a system that depends on hundreds, millions of 11-day-old specialized eggs on a standby basis. In addition, because the pandemic could result from avian influenza strain that is lethal to chickens, it is impossible to ensure that the eggs will be available to produce a vaccine when needed. Many nations, as well as the World Health Organization, are working on a stockpile of antiviral drugs in preparation for a possible pandemic. Some of the antiviral drugs. Neuraminidase inhibitors are a class of drug that includes Zanamivir and Oseltamivir, the latter being licensed as prophylaxis in the treatment in the United Kingdom. Oseltamivir, this is the trade name Tamiflu, is the most commonly sought drug since it is available in a pill form. Zanamivir is the trade name Relenza, and it is considered of use, and it must be inhaled. Other antiviral drugs are less likely to be effective against pandemic influenza, and there is much debate about whether Tamiflu or whether Relenza will also be effective against these strains. Oseltamivir inhibits the influenza virus from spreading inside the user's body. If you recall, we said the virus can spread very rapidly in the body because once infected, it does not require receptors to be able to enter adjacent cells. Now, Oseltamivir is marketed by Roche as Tamiflu. The drug has become the focus of some governments and organizations trying to see if making preparations for the possible H5N1 pandemic. In August 2005, Roche agreed to donate 3 million courses of Tamiflu to the World Health Organization to be deployed by the World Health Organization to contain a pandemic in its regions of origin. Although Tamiflu is patented, international law gives governments wide freedom to issue compulsory licenses for life-saving drugs. A second class of drug includes amantadine and ranitidine. This targets the M2 protein but are ineffective against H5N1. In the cases of flu pandemic, to avoid the risk of contracting H5N1 or indeed any other strain of the flu virus, people may have to take certain precautions and make changes to their routine to minimize the risk of infection. They may also have to prepare for the possibility of their lives being disrupted in a significant way, even if they do not actually become ill. A flu pandemic could cause major disruptions in everyday life, with footpaths and countrysides being partially or even totally off limits, and even restrictions on public gatherings such as public meetings, parties, services at places of worship, quarantine and bans on individual traveling, and certain other locations. Plan for the possibility the usual services will be disrupted. These could include services provided by hospitals and other healthcare facilities, banks, stores, restaurants, government offices, and post offices. Public preparedness should also include think of a backup plan. What could you do, for example, if you could not buy food from the supermarket or because the supermarket is closed? Public preparedness should also include thinking about the possibility of having to grow your own food and, if it was possible, to stock up on essentials. Public preparedness should also include preparing backup plans in case public gatherings are canceled. Keep in touch via telephone, for instance. Also, public preparedness should consider how to care for people with special needs or with severe illnesses or disabilities in cases where services that rely on not available. Could medicine be delivered to the house, for example? By traveling less, working from the home, closing schools, there is less opportunity for the virus to spread. Some respiratory etiquette would also be appropriate. Placing one's hand in the front of the mouth when coughing and sneezing can somewhat limit the dispersal of droplets. It has been suggested recently that covering one's mouth and nose with one's hand is not effective in stopping the spread of germs, as these germs are retained in the hand and then are deposited on doorknobs, countertops, and other places where the hands will go. Current thinking suggests that coughing and sneezing into the crook of one's arm would be the preferable way to limit the germ spread. Currently, wearing a mask is not recommended for routine use, such as in public, for preventing common influenza exposure. In the United States, disposable surgical procedural masks have been widely used by healthcare settings to prevent exposure to respiratory infections, but the use of the mask has not been used commonly in community settings such as schools, businesses, or public gatherings. Now, no mask can provide a perfect barrier, but products that meet or exceed NIOSH standard is the N95 standard recommended by the World Health Organization. This is thought to provide good protection. The N95 mask, which is recommended by the World Health Organization, this World Health Organization recommends that healthcare workers wear the N95 mask, and these patients wear surgical masks, which would prevent respiratory secretions from becoming airborne. It may be useful to remind the wearer not to touch his face. This will reduce infection due to contact to contaminated surfaces, especially crowded public places where coughing and sneezing and people have no way of washing their hands. The mask itself can become contaminated and must be handled with medical waste when removed. Frequent hand washing, especially there has been in contact with other people or potentially contaminated surfaces, can be very helpful. Alcohol-based hand sanitizers will also kill both bacteria and viruses. There is no evidence that properly cooked poultry or eggs can be a source of infection for avian influenza virus. That's a misnomer. The United States government carefully controls domestic and imported food products, and in 2004 issued a ban on importation of poultry from countries affected by the avian influenza virus, including the H5N1 strain. This ban is still in place. As a general rule in the United States, the public schools observe wildlife, including wild birds, from a distance. This protects you from the possible exposure to pathogens and minimizes the disturbances of animals to avoid. I said that wrong. It protects you from the possible exposure of pathogens and minimizes the disturbances to the animals. It also, and I should address for public preparedness, avoid touching wildlife. If there is contact to avian wildlife, do not rub your eyes, do not eat, drink, or smoke before washing your hands with soap and water. Do not pick up diseased or dead avian wildlife. Contact your state, tribal, federal, natural resource agencies if a sick or dead animal is found. The World Health Organization has developed a global influenza preparedness plan which defines stages of pandemic, outlines the World Health Organization's role, and makes recommendations for recommendations as well. Investigations of small clusters of cases are currently ongoing in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, to rule out limited human-to-human spread, which would signify Phase 4. The inter-pandemic period comes in phases. Phase 1 is low risk, no new influenza virus subtypes dangerous to humans detected in humans or animals. Phase 2, new viruses, a new circulating animal influenza virus subtype poses a potential risk to human disease, but no new influenza subtypes have been detected in humans. Phase 3 is self-limiting, human infections with new subtype, but no human-to-human spread, or at most, rare instances of spread to close contact. Even without human intervention, this would be a self-limiting process amongst humans. And then Phase 4, which is a person-to-person, small clusters with a limited human-to-human transmission, but spread is highly localized, suggesting that the virus is not well adapted to humans. An epidemic is possible, but it has not yet happened. In Phase 5, this is the epidemic. Larger clusters, human-to-human spread, still localized, suggesting that the virus is becoming increasingly well adapted to humans, but may not yet be fully transmissible. This is a substantial pandemic risk. Phase 6 is pandemic. Increased sustained transmission in the general population. The H5N1 is currently adapted to birds, making the disease it causes a bird flu, not a human flu. This strain causes a 50% death rate in humans who catch it. There is a significant evidence that this death is not due to missing mild cases. There is not yet a pandemic of the H5N1. If it occurs, it will be a human flu virus, which means that the strain adapted to humans. No one knows what the mortality rate would be.